Hello again. Today we're going to go over the footage for building the plywood cutting table stand deal thingamajigger. It's a pretty simple setup, really. It's just a pair of oversized sawhorses and then some rails that go essentially permanently attached to it. The goal is to be able to put a sheet of plywood onto the board, onto the table, and then use the track saw to cut them so that I don't ever have to try and wrangle with them to, fight with a table saw. The lumber being used is all cottonwood that is oversized, and most of the boards were essentially the pieces left at the end of milling to get 1-inch siding. So as I take the mill and work down towards the mill bed, I don't like going closer than 2 or so inches, usually 3 inches, to the mill bed, just because at that point the stops in the clamp tend to start getting in the way or can't be used. Like if you go really thin boards, you can't use the log clamps. So I just tend to avoid that and figure I can use that lumber in other ways instead of continuing to mill it. A lot of the times I'll flip those on their sides so they're 3 inches wide, and then I'll stand them up and clamp them back in place, and then keep taking 1-inch pieces off, which can then be used for trim and battens and things like that. And then I'm left with basically a 3x3 or 4x4-ish type size when I get done with that. So what I've got done so far is propped up on the left side of the wall. I've got 2 5-foot long, essentially 2x8s, and I'm figuring out which boards are going to work the best for the rails and which ones are going to work for the legs, which are going to be 33 inches long. And I'm taking whatever boards I'm going to use for those rails, and I'm propping them up against the north wall where the door is, so that they're just out of the way. And I figured I'd use, just for stability's sake, I'm using some of the thicker boards for the legs, and so I'm working on cutting them down to the 33 inches. And they're just slightly thicker than the circular saw can handle, so you have to make a series of cuts. And I had the idea after that first one that I could probably get away with doing kind of a production type deal where I cut all of the cuts that I need to on one side of that longer board, and then roll it and make all of the next cuts, and then roll it and make all of the last cuts to actually break it into individual pieces. And that worked out pretty well. Now, a normal sawhorse, like the little sawhorses that I'm using on the right side of the trailer, they're built essentially as an I-beam, and then having the legs attached to that, so you get a lot of strength and stability from having that I-beam. and then the lumber can hold quite a bit of weight in a compression scenario where it's pushing down on the board in an upright position, so that as legs and posts, they work really, really well, and you don't have to have a super huge leg or post to be able to withstand a lot of weight, because, I mean, essentially it's because the tree is built that way. I mean, the whole tree is built to withstand the weight of the tree on the trunk. So, for instance, the ash trees we have in our forest, they're 120 feet tall and 20 inches at the diameter for some of the bigger ones, 24-ish in that range. There is an awful lot of weight. I mean, thousands and thousands of pounds on that little base, 20, 24, 16, 18, whatever, and it supports it just fine. So little 2x4s work for the regular sawhorses. I figured, these are cottonwood, it is a weaker wood, it is a softer wood. So using these, they're 3.5 by 3.5 is what they actually worked out to be, would make an ideal leg. It's a good size. I'll never have to worry about it. But since there's no I-beam, I'm attaching them a little bit differently, and part of the reason for not using an I-beam is because I specifically do not want any screws in the top of the board. That's why the the beams for the sawhorse is a really, really tall beam, so that I just don't ever have to worry about the fact that I'm going to be, cutting into it every time I make a cut. The rails are a little bit more of a concern, but those are easy enough to replace without any major structure. I also didn't use any glue or nails in this project specifically so that if I do have to take them apart down the road, I can. But what I did was use the sawhorses that I already have built as essentially a model and figure out what angle they were at without actually any calculations. So I propped one of them up along one of the existing legs, and then took that and just used the level to figure out where plumb was, marked that, and then I cut that and used it to mark all the rest of them. And so what I'm doing now is taking all of those legs, I've got them all lined up and got the tops in the exact same spot. I figured out I want 3 screws in each, and so I just used the level as a guide, put it across the top, and then drew a line across the bottom of the level, and then drew another 2 lines using the width of the level, or I guess, yeah, the width, so that it worked out to be that the first screw is about 3 inches down from the top of the leg, and then the other 2 are about 1.5 inches, below subsequently. And then it's just a matter of marking where they want to be, and I put them a couple of inches away from the end of the sawhorse and on the outside of where 4 feet wide would be, so that the rails would be at 4 feet from outer edge to outer edge, and then the legs can be in, off to the side of that. That's one mistake that I did make in making these, is that it created complications using a full sheet of plywood, trying to clamp the track saw guide down, because the 2 outer boards are actually 4 feet from outer edge to outer edge, there's nothing to clamp a 4-foot wide sheet of plywood to. Although I guess I just had a thought that instead of trying to clamp the saw guide to the plywood only, I think the clamps are actually tall enough I could just clamp to the rail in addition to the plywood. So just put the plywood in place, put the clamp in place, and then just put the clamp underneath the rail and clamp the saw guide to the rail with the plywood in between. That I'm going to have to try that the next time I cut a plywood. Hopefully I remember that. So what I'm doing now is that I do want to stabilize the legs, because the screws in the cottonwood aren't going to be completely strong. So I don't know if, I guess I should have pointed it out at the beginning of the video, but one of the thinner boards had started to bend, and I tried to measure it to take the least bent part, but I decided that since I have two extra thicker boards, they're like 2.5 by 4, that I would take the bent board and cut it up into small sections and use that as bracing to help lock the legs into place. And that worked out pretty well. So now we're just going to take these last two pieces of lumber and turn them into the rails. Then the next challenge is that I want them locked into place so that the sawhorses are helping to support each other. So I've got to notch out where they're going to go, and I sort of created a cheater half lap. Essentially, I cut as deep as as the circular saw would go into the sawhorse beam, and then knocked all of that out, cleaned it up, and I took what was left and notched the difference into the bottom of the rails. And we were looking for a hammer, and Emily saw that the hatchet was sitting there, hanging there. So I thought, sure, why not? I'll try it. And then I realized instead of pounding on it like I would normally with a hammer, I thought to try just using the hatchet as a lever. And I can't believe I've never thought about that before. When you take these, so you run the saw back and forth, well, not back and forth, you run it forth multiple times to create little boards that are like 1/8 to maybe 1/4 inch thick, and then when you get them all done, you take a hammer and you pound them all sideways, and they break pretty close to the bottom of that cut. Well, if you use a hatchet instead of a hammer and just wedge the hatchet in there and then just jerk the handle sideways, it does an amazing job of actually breaking all of those at almost completely the bottom of that cut. It did a so well that I repeated that every single time, and I definitely will do that anytime I have to make half lap cuts like this. So it's so much faster, so much cleaner. There was almost no waste. It took just a few quick passes with the chisel to get that cleaned up and flat. So if you ever find yourself needing to do this kind of a thing, by all means, grab yourself a hatchet or a pry bar or something that you can wedge in there and just jerk sideways and just snap them all at the same time. It's like little wood playing cards. So we'll get this last one cleaned out. And then it's just a matter of figuring out, you see, how deep this needs to be notched. So I just put them in place marked where the top of the beam is on the rail, and then I can use just the saw itself and lower it down to that mark, flip it over and make my half lap cuts. And it was a little more challenging on these shallower cuts, so there was just a little bit more to clean out, but it still worked quite well. And so it's just a matter of adjusting it for each different depth, because the boards are slightly different sizes. The battery died there, but it didn't miss too much. I'm down to just the last couple of cuts, and the video will end up a little bit shy of actually finishing, which was kind of disappointing because the battery was fresh. I don't know why the camera just decided it needed to quit. But that's okay. It still worked out quite well, and in future videos the track saw worked out quite well, and I'm not sponsored or anything by anybody. I paid for it. Actually, I technically paid for it twice, because Amazon had the best deal on it as a package deal. Home Depot had a slightly similar deal, but was like $25-30 more, so I figured I'd buy it from Amazon. Well, they shipped, it was a saw box and a track box, because they're very, very different sized, and Amazon only shipped one package, but I didn't know there was an issue with that at the time. And that ended up being that we picked up the package and there was only the track, and the post office said, nope, there's just one tracking number, there's just one box. So I spent the next 6 weeks fighting with Amazon to get that replaced. And so the next video will have better footage and show what's going on, and we'll go from there. But the tracks all worked out amazingly, so that's what I was trying to get to. So thank you for watching. God bless you and yours, and stay safe out there.